Gary, Indiana was called the Magic City of Steel. It was nothing but sand and wetlands when it was founded by U.S. Steel in 1906. But within 10 years, Gary was a modern, prosperous city, home to America's greatest manufacturing plant and America's most innovative school system. People from across the country came to see for themselves what this Magic City of Steel was all about. After 10 years of growth, the people of Gary could take pleasure in the glory of their young city. But the city's childhood was about to end. Gary was ready to experience the pains of growing up.
We are teaching to sing your glory. Our joy and sorrows will be your story. Gary, my home of love and lay. Gary, my home of learn and play. Gary, my home of sports and best. Gary, my home of work and rest.
All she wanted was to be left alone. Alice Mabel Gray was a graduate of the University of Chicago, but she was a bit different.
I want to live my own life, a free life. The life of a salary earner in the city is slavery, a constant fight for the means of living.
A poem by Lord Byron caught her attention.
Then stirs the feeling infinite, so felt in solitude where we are least alone.
She wanted to live in solitude, so in 1916, at age 34, she quit her job in Chicago and moved to an area that was still wilderness, just east of the growing city of Gary, Indiana. She moved into an abandoned shack in the sand dunes on the shores of Lake Michigan. All she wanted was to be left alone, but the world wouldn't comply. Fishermen who worked along the lake saw her. They told Chicago newspaper reporters about a beautiful maiden who swam nude in Lake Michigan at night and disappeared at the approach of a man. This mystery woman had no story, so the newspapers made one up. Maybe she was running away from a failed romance, they said. They also made up a name. They called her Diana of the Dunes. The newspaper stories captured the imagination of the public. Everyone wanted to know more about this mystery woman. She had become a celebrity. The newspapers traced down people who knew her.
At Old South Division High School, where we were graduated, she was known for her remarkable mind and her capable scholarship. She was somewhat aloof and disinclined for the companionship of people.
Chicago newspaper readers read regular stories about Diana of the Dunes. People would come up to her shack and peek in the windows. Some invited themselves inside to take a look. Excursion boats even brought Chicago sightseers to her cabin. Diana died in 1925, never able to completely find the solitude she was looking for. Her last wish was to be cremated, with her ashes spread along her beloved lakeshore. Again, she didn't get her wish. Her parents buried her in Gary's Oak Hill Cemetery. Next door to where Diana lived, the city of Gary was in its infancy. It, too, was learning one important lesson that Diana learned. Sometimes factors beyond your control determine your fate.
A war was on in Europe. It started in 1914. The battles were being fought in the hometowns and villages of many of the immigrants who lived in Gary. When the United States entered the war in 1917, these Serbian Americans were ready to sign up and fight. The draft board got to work. Newspaperman Tom Cannon said Gary's population did more than its part to help win the First World War.
Gary sent 7,500 men to the World War, in addition to the 22,000 men working day and night in the local mills, turning out war materials for their brothers at the front. World War statistics say the United States sent 3% of its citizenry to the war. Gary sent 13% of its manpower to the war. No other city in the country can show such a record.
The people on the home front did their part. Gary residents easily went past the goal for the sale of Liberty bonds. To make sure there was enough food, Gary residents planted war gardens. To preserve the country's supply of meat, they observed meatless days. And there were also heatless days and lightless nights to make sure the country had enough coal to get through the war. While the children of Gary played war, real soldiers from the Indiana National Guard were stationed in Etna to protect the gunpowder plant, the railways, and other vital sites.
Another thing that brought the war to the very back doors of Gary people were the constant troop movements, as mysterious as they were awe-compelling. Thousands of long trains rolled almost constantly through Gary, carrying soldiers, artillery, camp equipment, and all of the paraphernalia of war to the eastern seaboard for embarkation to France.
On November 11, 1918, people crowded around the window of the Gary Post where the latest news was posted. The report came into the newspaper office at 2 that morning. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Mayor Hodges gave the okay to let every city fire truck drive through the city with sirens screaming. The war was over.
In 10 minutes, Broadway was packed. The jam was so great it took 10 minutes just to cross the street. The pandemonium magnified as the day went on. Parade after parade kept Broadway an unceasing bedlam.
97 Gary residents lost their lives in World War I. The dead included Frank Knotts. He was one of Gary's first residents, brought to the city as a boy by his father, Tom Knotts, Gary's first mayor. The dead also included Gary men born in Poland, in Turkey, in Russia, in Sweden, Wales, Serbia, Canada, Greece, Croatia, England, Scotland, Italy, and Bosnia, as well as American-born men, both white and black.
Despite the sacrifices made by Gary's immigrants, questions were often raised about which country they were loyal to, America or their native land. A warning sign in the mill, posted in several different languages, was evidence that Gary was a huge mix of people who did not have a common language, common history, common culture, nor a common outlook on life. With little in common, there was a lot of suspicion. Parades were frequently held to stir up patriotism for America. There were meetings and rallies held at U.S. Steel to remind the workers which country they were in. There were no reports of Gary's immigrants being disloyal to America, but these were suspicious times, and the government kept a watch on Gary's immigrant community. The war created suspicion and a wider gap between Gary's native-born Americans and European immigrants.
Before the war, a recession hurt the steel industry. Many were laid off, and some children in Gary raided trash cans at night looking for food. But once the war began in Europe, U.S. Steel had a booming business. It was making record profits. Newspaperman Tom Cannon wrote that business picked up before the United States went to war and really picked up after that.
Gary's steel mills and fabricating plants that had been making munitions of war for Great Britain and France were speeded to their utmost facilities, making war munitions for our own government. Gary Works, with every furnace in full blast and with every auxiliary plant in operation, was making ship plates, steel for monster guns, artillery wheels and axles, as well as every other conceivable instrument of war.
The good times in the mill made everyone optimistic. With the booming economy, there were again predictions of Gary's greatness. A population of 500,000 people seemed a real possibility. But not everyone was feeling good. Not everyone was benefiting from the good times. Nationwide, a movement was developing. Workers were organizing. They were demanding changes.
They worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week in the mill. They were paid 16 cents an hour. Being a steel worker was not an easy job. On the blast furnace, workers would spend 7 days on the night shift, followed by 7 days on the day shift. Those who worked Sunday mornings would have to keep working until Monday morning. That way, they could change to the night shift the following week. In other words, every other Sunday, they would have to work a 24-hour day. One steel worker wrote about the experience.
A short, stocky Italian was shoveling with me. We rested between ladles in a little breeze that came through between furnaces. "What you think of this job?" he asked. "Pretty bad," I said, "but pretty good money." He looked up, and the veins swelled on his forehead, his cheeks were inflamed, and his eyes showed the effects of 20 hours of continuous labor. "To hell with money," he said with quiet passion. "No can live."
There was no life outside of the mill for many, especially those who worked the long turn, as the 24-hour shift was known.
You have 10 hours for recuperation after 24 hours' work. Washing up in a hurry, getting breakfast, and walking home get you to bed by 8 o'clock. 8 hours sleep is the best you can get. At 4 o'clock you must dress, eat, and walk to the mill. After the 10 hours off, you return to the mill at 5 o'clock to begin another 12 hours of steel making.
Although Gary's Miller Lakefront was a popular place for summer fun, In 1920, a social worker discovered that some immigrant steel workers who lived in the city for as long as 12 years had never even seen Lake Michigan. The steel industry was making large profits in the rapidly growing American economy. Even though other industries were instituting 8-hour days, the steel industry refused to change. In 1957, poet Carl Sandburg visited Gary and the mill. 42 years earlier, in 1915, he wrote a poem called The Mayor of Gary.
I asked the mayor of Gary about the 12-hour day and the 7-day week, and the mayor of Gary answered, "More workmen steal time on the job in Gary than any other place in the United States. Go into the plants and you will see men sitting around doing nothing. Machinery does everything," said the mayor of Gary when I asked him about the 12-hour day and the 7-day week. And he wore cool cream pants, the mayor of Gary, and white shoes, and a barber had fixed him up with a shampoo and a shave, and he was easy and imperturbable. Though the government weather bureau thermometer said 96, and children were soaking their heads at bubbly fountains on the street corners. And I said goodbye to the mayor of Gary and went out from the city hall and turned the corner into Broadway. And I saw workmen wearing leather shoes scrubbed with fire and cinders and pitted with little holes from running molten steel. And some had bunches of specialized muscles around their shoulder blades, hard as pig iron. Muscles of their forearms were sheet steel, and they looked to be like men who had been somewhere.
Nationwide, the American Federation of Labor was demanding changes. They wanted an 8-hour day, a 6-day week, abolition of the 24-hour shift, better wages, and collective bargaining. The steel industry, led by Judge Elbert H. Gary, would not bend. In the fall of 1919, steel workers nationwide walked off the job.
18,000 men worked at the mill in Gary. 85% of them went on strike. It was one of the strongest showings at any mill in the country. The workers said all they wanted was a better life for themselves and their families. They wanted better hours, better wages, and the right to be recognized as a union. But the steel industry fought back by labeling the strikers as radicals. Nationwide, Americans were afraid of what was happening in Russia. Bolsheviks, communists, Reds were overthrowing governments, all in the name of the working man. The steel company said, that's what strikers really want, to overthrow the American way of life. Senator Miles Poindexter from the state of Washington took the floor of the Senate to denounce the strikers.
The purpose of the steelworkers in their strike at Gary, Indiana, are not merely to obtain higher wages or shorter hours of labor or improved conditions of work. It clearly appears from the evidence that their purpose gets far beyond that. It reaches to the scheme of subverting the authority of the law, and that means subverting the authority of the government. In other words, it is a revolutionary movement.
In Gary, newspaper headlines also screamed about a communist plot. Mayor Hodges backed the steel company. He said militants should be deported, and he put restrictions on picketing. Police Chief William Forbes vowed to fill his jail with whiskered revolutionists every day, and Gary police escorted replacement workers into the mills.
The steel company wanted to keep the mills open, so they looked for workers to replace the strikers. The company recruited black and Mexican workers. In 1910, there were only 100 African Americans working in U.S. steel in Gary. During the strike, it rose to 2,000. Before the war, when the economy was bad, white workers regarded blacks as competition for jobs. Blacks were kept out of social and union organizations. Now black workers felt this was their chance to prove they were good workers and to earn the kind of money that white people were earning.
In October of 1919, it was tense in Gary. A trolley car filled with dozens of strikebreakers, many of whom were black, stopped at a railroad crossing to let another train pass. As the car stood there, strikers taunted the passengers. A small riot broke out. The next day, Mayor Hodges asked for the state militia to be set in and banned public gatherings. But the militiamen were not feared. Many of them joined the militia to avoid fighting in World War I, and as they marched into Gary, veterans of the war led the jeers. The veterans in their uniforms led a parade of strikers down Broadway, defying the mayor's order against public gatherings.
The militia was assembled in front of the city hall, and they were called to attention, and they remained that way while the shouting, jeering column moved past. The troops were ordered to follow and break up the parade, but then Mayor Hodges appeared and yelled, "Hell no! It would be suicide. Let it go. I've just requested federal troops, and they're on their way."
Gary was under martial law. General Leonard Wood sent 1,500 federal troops into the city under the command of Colonel William Mapes. Mapes left no doubt about what side the soldiers were on.
The steel strike in Gary was fostered by Reds and revolutionists in the hopes of plunging the entire country into a nationwide revolt.
The workers' fight was lost. Federal troops were everywhere, and they made a show of strength. They made mass arrests. They raided homes and buildings of strike leaders. Most of all, they broke the spirit of the strikers. America was watching Gary. When Gary steel workers returned to their jobs, 300,000 other strikers nationwide followed. The steel industry won the battle.
The strike left its scars. Before the strike, Judge Elbert H. Gary was one of the more enlightened leaders in the industry. While most steel executives agreed with Cornelius Vanderbilt, who said the public be damned, Gary told steel executives to respect public opinion. But the strike changed Gary's image in the eyes of some. As a spokesman for the steel industry, he was seen as an enemy to the working man. He was a symbol of the evils that many saw in big business. In fact, Gary often indicated flexibility on the issue of hours and pay. But when it came to recognizing the union's demand for collective bargaining, he would not budge.
Our corporation and subsidiaries, although they do not combat labor unions as such, decline to do business with them. The corporation and its subsidiaries are opposed to the closed shop. They stand for the open shop, which permits one to engage in any line of employment, whether one does or does not belong to a labor union.
The battle over union recognition was what the strike was really about. Within 5 years of the strike's end, the workers got almost everything they had been fighting for. By 1924, steel workers of Gary were given 3 pay hikes. The 7-day work week was abolished, and the 8-hour day was established. But the steel company still refused to recognize the union for collective bargaining.
The strike was also blamed for destroying race relations south of the tracks in Gary. Before the strike, blacks and immigrant whites lived together in this poor neighborhood. Paul Drumley was a 13-year-old living on 22nd Avenue in that neighborhood during the strike.
That summer, colored people moved in Gary more and more and rented all over 22nd. The white people started to sell their homes and move to Glen Park. Lots of white people said the strike didn't work because the colored people came in the mills and boxcars. The hatred continued worse, and even today, after many years, there's a wide gap between the whites and colored on account of that strike.
By 1920, 10% of Gary residents were African American. Almost all lived on the south side, but white immigrants began moving out of that area, moving south to the Glen Park neighborhood on Gary's far south side. The old south side was now called Midtown, and as the 1920s progressed, it was becoming increasingly black.
The war had already slowed down the number of foreign immigrants coming to America, and after the strike, Americans felt even stronger about keeping foreigners out of the country. The great flood of immigrants coming to Gary was over. But in 1920, Gary was still very much a city of foreigners. Over 60% of city residents were either foreign-born or children of immigrants. The school system was working hard to make sure the children grew up as loyal Americans. This photo was taken in 1922 at the Bailey Branch Library across from Frable School in Midtown. The students proudly held signs showing their nationality, but they also proudly stood under the flag of the United States. Italians, Slovaks, Mexicans, all growing up as Americans. The schools were leading the way.
With the war over, a new era of prosperity was on its way for Gary, and it was a time of progress for women. Up until this time, women were not allowed to vote. Women nationwide felt they should have the same right as men to cast a ballot. They were working and contributing to society, but were not allowed to choose their political leaders.
I know I owned a couple of lots. I bought a couple of lots, and I had to pay the taxes on the lots, so I considered the whole thing taxation without representation.
In 1920, women were finally given the right to vote. In Gary, they formed their own political clubs, like this group of Lake County Republican women. But a lot of men still didn't think women were smart enough to vote. Mechanical voting machines were being used in the 1920 election in Gary. Many men felt women wouldn't be able to figure out how the machines worked. To help the women out on Election Day, the polls were staffed by people who demonstrated how to work the machines. The Gary Post-Tribune reported the women had no problems, but many men did.
This is attributed to the businesslike demeanor of the fair voter while witnessing the demonstrations. Men, dividing their attention between the machine and discussions, entered the booth in many cases unable to operate the machine as a result of their indifference to the demonstrator. The women paid attention.
Early in 1921, Gary lost his first politician. Tom Knotts hoped the immigrants would help him make a political comeback in 1916. They remained loyal to him, but Knotts lost the race for Lake County Sheriff. It was his last run for political office. He ran an insurance and real estate business in his last years, and in 1921, Tom Knotts died. Gary mourned the passing of Knotts, a man of many firsts in Gary. He was the first to bring his family to live here, its first postmaster, and its only town board president, and its first mayor. Thousands came to pay last respects as the city went into mourning, and famed lawyer Clarence Darrow delivered the eulogy.
Tom Knotts did not cringe before the powerful, nor was he content to drift with the tide. Such a man must naturally lead a stormy life.
The 1921 election was a significant one for two reasons. R.O. Johnson, who was defeated 4 years earlier, was back. This time he won and became the first to serve 2 terms as mayor. But it was also an historic election for Gary's rapidly growing African-American population. Arthur Brown Whitlock came to Gary and started a produce business with a horse and a wagon. In 5 years' time, he was a very successful local businessman. And in 1921, A.B. Whitlock became the first African-American elected to the city council.
In the days before most people could afford a car, workers lived close to the mill so they could walk to work, or they took a streetcar. Paul Drumley remembers what those days were like.
The first streetcars went from the South Shore tracks to 22nd Avenue. It cost 3 cents to ride. It was better than walking, if you had the 3 cents. Them days a man worked all day for $1.25. On Sunday, people used to go for a ride in the streetcar just for a pastime. Some would go to the end of the line with picnic baskets.
From the start, Gary residents had rail transportation into Chicago. One of the lines which stopped in Gary was the Chicago, Lake Shore, and South Bend Railroad, known as the South Shore. In the 1920s, the South Shore was the main route for Chicagoans who came to play on the sand dunes of northwest Indiana. It was also the route for Gary residents who wanted to spend a day in Chicago.
Automobiles were also becoming more common. It was obvious that the road between Gary and Michigan City couldn't handle the congestion, especially on weekends when people drove to the Indiana Dunes lakefront. Work was begun in the early 1920s on the Dunes Highway. Engineers had to once again wade through the marshes and level sand dunes. But before long, the road was built and was being called the busiest highway in America. The 1920s brought prosperity to Gary. Buildings like the Gary Hotel, built less than 20 years earlier, were giving way to bigger, more modern structures. Gary State Bank replaced its building at 5th and Broadway. What it built was an impressive addition to Gary's skyline. Just down the street, the Knights of Columbus built a 10-story structure. Around the corner, City Methodist Church was built, and construction was completed on Memorial Auditorium. More than 1,800 apartment units were added to Gary's housing supply in the 1920s, including these in the Horace Mann district. And some fine homes were built in the city during these years.
In its early days, Gary enjoyed its entertainment, and the 1920s were a great time to enjoy the stage and screen. The Gary Theater, just north of 5th and Broadway, billed itself as the city's pride. It was built at 5th and Broadway at a cost of $150,000. For $1.50, you could get the best seat in the house and see vaudeville acts like the Marx Brothers. Cheap seats went for $0.25. Meanwhile, movie houses were drawing huge crowds. Circus acts prospered before the war. Even the Great Buffalo Bill brought his show to Gary. After the war, the circus still drew crowds.
The beachfront at Miller was popular with Gary residents from the early days of the city. The lakefront was a favorite spot for many of Gary's young people. Carr's Beach at the foot of Lake Street attracted big crowds on the weekends. After Miller was annexed in 1918, U.S. Steel bought land along the lakefront and donated it to the city. It became Lakefront Park, later changed to Marquette Park in 1930. But like most city parks in Gary, the beach was segregated, whites only. Black Gary residents were not welcome, and few attempted to break the color barrier.
New stores were also entertaining Gary residents. These were the days when you could still buy something for under $1, and they were days of new technology. A new Sears store opened in 1929. Besides featuring the latest fashions, the store also bragged about a new innovation, the cash register.
When you make a purchase in the new Sears, Roebuck & Company store, the amount will be rung up on a modern national cash register, and a printed receipt like the one shown here, bearing registered printed figures, will be handed to you or wrapped with the goods.
It was an unprecedented time of prosperity for Gary, an unprecedented time of prosperity for U.S. Steel. It was clear that the fate of the city rested on the fate of U.S. Steel. As long as times were good, there were no problems. During this time, some new industry did move to Gary. The Anderson Company came in 1923. It made parts for Model T Fords and later windshield wipers. But very few other companies settled in Gary. Some said the reason was U.S. Steel. Many in town felt the company kept other industry out. It didn't want other companies stealing its workers or influencing the overall wage rate in the area. Captain Horace Norton, who ran U.S. Steel's land company, frequently denied those charges. But the Gary Commercial Club, which served as sort of a chamber of commerce in the city, made no attempt to attract other companies here in the prosperous 1920s. The club was controlled by Captain Norton, so while Gary prospered, it also remained a one-industry town.
One thing you couldn't do, at least not legally, was drink alcohol. Prohibition was the law of the land. It was also widely ignored in Gary. Police proudly showed off when they confiscated a steal, but they generally ignored the speakeasy and widespread bootlegging in the city. The occasional raid put some of the small-time bootleggers out of business, but the bigger bootleggers and mobsters were earning a fortune making and selling liquor. People were creative in hiding their illegal liquor, such as the pint of whiskey police found hidden in the butcher's block. But in many cases, it didn't have to be hid. Everyone who wanted liquor knew where to get it or how to make it. The law was ignored. Instead of controlling vice, as it was intended to do, the Prohibition law led to a decline in Gary's moral tone.
It also led to corruption in city government. Police Chief William Forbes was publicly against Prohibition. He said the law hurt the poor, hard-working fellow who needs a glass of beer. Publicly, Mayor R.O. Johnson swore he would enforce the law, but privately, some said he had the best supply of corn liquor in the city. And in 1923, federal investigators said the mayor had conspired to violate the Prohibition laws. He wasn't alone. 62 others were indicted, including City Judge William Dunn, the county sheriff, the prosecutor, several lawyers, and policemen. Dunn and 4 others were convicted and jailed, but Johnson got hit the hardest. The city's mayor was sentenced to 18 months in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. After his appeals ran out, Johnson resigned as mayor, and city controller William J. Fulton took his place. A month later, Johnson and the 4 others were off to jail.
Johnson resigned as mayor just over a month before the 1925 primary election. Mayor Fulton tried, but he lost the Republican primary to Floyd Williams. In the fall, Williams went on to win a big victory and became Gary's 5th mayor. One group supporting Williams was the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was at the height of its power in Indiana in the 1920s. It formed a chapter in Gary in 1921 and claimed to have over 1,300 members. In the 20s, they showed up in full robes at the funeral of a member of Gary's Ridge Lawn Cemetery. The Klan was anti-black, anti-Jew, anti-Catholic, and anti-immigrant. In the 1925 election, the Klan posed as the enemy of vice, prostitution, and alcohol. The Klan endorsed Williams for mayor. Williams denied being a member, but welcomed their support. At about the same time, the Klan's national leader, D.C. Stevenson, was arrested for drugging, molesting, and killing a young woman. The organization's reputation as the protector of traditional American morals was damaged, and it faded from the Gary scene.
Frable was the school attended by the children of immigrants and by many of Gary's African Americans. It was the city's only integrated school in the 20s, but the growing African American population was causing overcrowding in Frable and the city's all-black schools. On the north side, Emerson was not overcrowded, but it was all white. In September, to ease some of the crowding in other schools, 18 black high school students were transferred to Emerson. Within days, 600 white students walked out of class in protest. As they marched up Broadway behind a brass band, they painted signs on the sidewalk which read, "We won't go back until Emerson's white." Newspapers reported that by day 2, over 800 white students stayed home. Superintendent William Wirt met with the striking students to explain the transfers and tried to answer their questions.
One youth asked boldly from the back of the auditorium,
"Why doesn't Gary have schools exclusively for colored children like there are down south?"
His inquiry was greeted with applause, loud and long. Another youth proclaimed amid loud shouts and whistles of his co-strikers,
"We want a white school or none."
A girl asked why she was forced to eat in the school cafeteria with colored students.
By the third day, over 1,000 students stayed home. Student Council President Sam Chase was against the strike. He tried to convince the students to go back. So did Senior Class President Jack Keener. He stood in front of the angry students to voice his opinion.
"I think you should return to school and settle this question sanely."
The two student leaders were jeered. Strike leaders Winfield Eshelman and Leonard Boynton demanded that Chase and Keener resign. The strikers again marched down Broadway, and as they did, Mayor Floyd Williams tipped his hat and applauded as the band marched past him. The next day, the mayor called together school board members and prominent city leaders like U.S. Steel Plant Superintendent William Gleason and Land Company boss Horace Norton. They agreed to give the strikers what they wanted. The striking students were given excused absences for the days they were on strike, and the African-American students were transferred back to a black school.
The newspaper headline said the strike was off and everyone was happy, but the headline writer probably didn't talk to anyone who was black. The city council met that night to consider another part of the deal, a plan to build an all-black temporary school in a swampy, undeveloped area at 25th and Georgia Streets. African-American Councilman A.B. Whitlock led the fight against the proposal in a debate with Mayor Williams that night.
What if temporary school structures are built at 25th and Georgia? None of my people would send their children to school there. Why, there aren't even sidewalks or streets out there, let alone water, lights, or sewers. The building would be nothing but shelters.
Everything necessary to make the school convenient and easily reached will be done. I promise you, as chief executive and as mayor of the city, that everything that I have enumerated to you will be done.
With all due respect to you, Mayor, I've heard promises before. I've been here a great many years, and I've heard a great many promises made. But I've not seen many of them kept.
The 10 white councilmen voted for the temporary school. The 3 black councilmen voted against. Before the vote was taken, Councilman Merritt Martindale told the black councilmen why they should vote yes.
Now I'm talking to you, Bill, A.B. and Doc, and I want you to listen to me. Gary needs its colored folks, boys, and this council needs you. But there is a difference in our color and race which we cannot overlook in this matter. If you leave these little colored youngsters in Emerson to continue to get their education, they wouldn't get any. Among all those white students, the colored children would be in a constant strain, tension which wouldn't allow them to study and apply themselves to learn their lessons.
The temporary school was never built, but the wheels were in motion to build a permanent high school for blacks only. And in 1931, proudly proclaiming that it was equal to the white schools in every way, the school system opened all-black Roosevelt High School.
During his life, Elbert H. Gary periodically visited the town which bore his name. In 1922, he came here, he visited Frabel School, and he also spoke to the Gary Commercial Club. He told them that his company would help build a city on a foundation that will stand, with good schools, churches, law, and order. Judge Gary once said his home was in New York, but his heart was in Gary. He made many financial contributions to the city, including money to build the Fifth Avenue YMCA. In 1927, he died. The city of Gary officially went into mourning. He was buried in his hometown of Wheaton, Illinois.
In Gary, some entertainment centered around the steel mill. There was the Indiana Steel Company Band, for instance. The mill also had a baseball team. And on Labor Day, there was something for everyone. People flocked to the annual Gary Works Field Day, sponsored by U.S. Steel. Newspaper reports said 25,000 showed up for the 16th annual Field Day in 1929.
At the Punch and Judy combat rings, youngsters were placed to straddle a 6-inch wooden pole which had a peculiar habit of rolling around and upsetting those who tried to maintain their equilibrium upon it. Provided with inflated punching bags, the combatants were permitted to whale the daylights out of each other, so long as they could maintain their precarious perches on the rotating bar.
In the afternoon, there were stage shows featuring acrobats, dog acts, and more. And throughout the day, kids and adults lined up for the merry-go-round. There were also tennis matches, horseshoes, and the biggest and strongest men in the steel mills faced off in a tug-of-war.
Ah, yes, and the greased pole. How diligently they tried. So up, and away they went, 4 feet, 6 feet, 10 feet, and then suddenly it would happen. They would come shooting down to terra firma.
The big event that packed spectators into the grandstand was track and field. The plate mill team walked away with the most victories, followed by the Coke plant, and the accountants finished third.
In 1925, R.O. Johnson resigned as mayor and went to prison for violating the prohibition laws. He didn't stay there long. He served 6 months of an 18-month sentence.
Mr. Johnson made no formal speech. He just laughed and joked with the crowd in an informal way, saying that he never felt better in his life and was anxious to get back into the harness after his enforced vacation.
It wasn't long before he was back in that harness. President Coolidge gave Johnson a pardon, and in 1929, Johnson ran again for mayor, and for the third time, he was elected.
But Johnson had no control over the economic forces sweeping the country. The stock market crashed in October, just days before the election. Prices plummeted on the New York Stock Exchange. Investors lost millions, and millions began to worry. In Gary, as elsewhere in America, people rushed to their banks to get their money out. One by one, the banks ran out of money and closed their doors. 2 Gary bank presidents committed suicide, including former Mayor William J. Fulton, leading to even more panic among the public. Before long, 12 of Gary's 13 banks were closed. Only Gary State Bank remained open. Thousands of city residents had lost their life savings.
It was a heartbreaker in that I had saved $200 to go to school in the summertime and further my education. And I go and try to take the money out of the Tolliston Bank, and the doors were closed, and all you got from them was a statement they didn't know when they'd open, they didn't know when you'd get the money. And some were in way worse shape than that because they had a whole lot more than I did in the banks.
The Depression also led to the loss of many jobs. U.S. Steel, which had been operating at 100% capacity in 1929, was down to 15% in 1932. That same year, wages were cut 25%. The story was the same throughout the city. Those who were fortunate enough to still have a job took pay cuts. City government was also in financial trouble. The city's money came from taxes, but people who lost their jobs and their savings couldn't pay their taxes. City workers and teachers like Hilda Burton, who was making $80 a month, were affected.
When it got really bad, the city of Gary couldn't pay us. I mean, they couldn't give the money to the schools because the taxes weren't being paid. No one could do it. So they gave us, the teachers, what they called scrip. And that was just a sheet of paper that said that when they had their taxes paid, they'd pay us the $80. Now, the paper did us no good. We had to have money.
Despite their own financial problems, teachers at Frable set up a soup kitchen each day at noon to feed neighborhood children and adults who needed help. The city tried to help. Mayor Johnson and the fire department, for example, collected and distributed Christmas toys for the needy. But it wasn't enough. The people of Gary were suffering.
The Depression sent Gary's poorest residents into an even deeper hole. Gary's African-American population had almost tripled during the 1920s. Gary had the fastest growing black population in America. Lured by the prospect of good jobs in the mills, large numbers came from Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and other southern states. As the 1930s began, nearly 18% of the city was black. No other city in the North had a higher percentage of black residents. Gary had also developed a growing Mexican population by 1930. By 1925, Mexicans were second only to Poles among the immigrant groups working at U.S. Steel. Like African Americans, Mexicans were brought in during the strike of 1919. But when the Depression hit, many were laid off, out of work, and on public relief. The Calumet Township trustee had an idea. Instead of paying relief to the Mexicans, why not save money by sending the Mexicans back to Mexico? Local civic leaders supported the idea, and there was a fund drive to pay for the one-way tickets. Some Mexicans went back voluntarily, but some, including one girl who was getting ready to board a boxcar back to Mexico, were not.
This is my country, but after the way we've been treated, I hope never to see it again. As long as my father was working and spending his money in Gary's stores, paying taxes and supporting us, it was all right. But now we found we can't get justice here.
1931 was not a good year to have a celebration. It was Gary's 25th anniversary as a city. But it was also the low point of the Depression. Still, the city had a parade. People lined the streets and watched the floats pass by. There were other things to win the attention of Gary residents in these dark days, including a scandalous murder case. 18-year-old Arlene Draves, known as Babe, was at a party with her boyfriend Virgil Kirkland. After an argument, he took her for a ride in a car, stopping at a secluded spot near 43rd in Connecticut, where she was repeatedly raped. She died that evening. Kirkland had been a high school football star, and the other 4 suspects in the case were also well known. The trial attracted huge crowds. The jury was told that Kirkland went to buy some hamburgers at a snack bar after the rape. He bragged to several customers about his conquest. The defense blamed Draves for the rape and said her other injuries were caused by an accidental fall. The jury found Kirkland guilty, but the judge threw out the verdict. A second trial was held, and after a guilty verdict on a lesser charge, the judge sentenced Kirkland to only 1 to 10 years in prison. Kirkland was released from jail in about 5 years.
The hope of Gary and the nation rested on Franklin Roosevelt. In 1932, the Democratic nominee was elected president. One of the goals of the new administration was to put people back to work. Gradually, a series of New Deal economic programs were giving Gary residents jobs again, jobs paid for by the federal government. People were put to work indexing back issues of the Gary newspapers and writing a guidebook to the Calumet region. Jobs were created building a disposal plant for the city of Gary, and more people were put to work building a pavilion at Marquette Park and a golf course at Gleason Park. Theater people were put to work producing plays for Gary's adults and children. The New Deal was primarily aimed at providing work, but it was also designed to create solutions to problems like housing. In 1939, with money provided by the federal government, work was completed on Gary's first housing project, the Delaney community. Gary residents were going back to work thanks to millions of dollars spent on these and other government-funded projects. When President Roosevelt visited Gary on a campaign stop in 1936, his popularity was high, and he was met by a huge crowd as he spoke from the back of his train.
But not everyone liked what Roosevelt was doing, including Gary's school superintendent, William Wirt. In the Roosevelt administration, government played a much bigger role in the daily affairs of business and the people. Some, like Wirt, felt America was moving toward a socialist economy. In 1933, Wirt attended a party in suburban Washington. The Gary school superintendent was shocked to hear the dinner conversation. According to Wirt, 6 people, 5 of them described as part of the Roosevelt Brain Trust, were talking about a revolution. Wirt said they talked about replacing Roosevelt with a communist leader like Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. Wirt went public with what he claimed to have heard, and he was national news. A congressional committee convened to investigate his charges. Time magazine was one of many news organizations attending.
In the big caucus room, while flash lamps winked, newsreel cameras purred, and squads of radio engineers and reporters elbowed through the jam-packed spectators, a special committee of representatives sat down to investigate charges of the utmost gravity.
President Roosevelt ignored the whole matter. All he said when asked was, "There's not very much to be said in the matter one way or the other. I shall go fishing and shall not give Dr. Wirt very much thought. I don't think anybody else would." Nothing ever came of Wirt's accusations.
More than any of his predecessors, President Roosevelt was friendly to the cause of organized labor. Conditions were finally right for the unions to be recognized by U.S. Steel. In 1936, the company gave the workers a 48-hour week, a 10% pay hike, and a 1-week vacation. Then in 1937, it happened. The Steel Workers Organizing Committee was officially recognized by the steel company in March. The negotiating committee proudly stood for a photo just before its first contract meeting with management. By the end of the 1930s, the union was building in strength, and in the 40s it changed its name to the United Steelworkers of America. The late 1930s saw the passing of the old guard in Gary. The first generation of city leaders began to disappear from the scene when William P. Gleason retired as superintendent of the Gary Works in 1935. A banquet was held to wish him well. A little more than a year after he retired, Gleason was dead at age 71. Not only did he oversee the construction of the world's largest steel plant, he also guided the development of the city's parks. He was the head of the Parks Department for over 2 decades and made sure Gary's parks were attractive and plentiful.
2 years later, another of Gary's powerful pioneers passed on. School Superintendent William Wirt died suddenly in March of 1938. About 2 years later, the school board began to dismantle the work-study play system, which made Gary's schools famous worldwide. Some said it was outdated. Some said it was too expensive to maintain. Parts of the system lived on in Gary for years to come. But by 1956, the work-study play system was dead in the Gary schools.
Later that year, Horace Norton retired as head of the Gary Land Company. With Gleason dead and Norton retired, U.S. Steel's role in the community began to change. Gleason and Norton were present at the city's birth. For them, the city was like a child, and they watched its every step and tried to guide it along what they felt was the right path. But times were changing, and future leaders of Gary Works came from a different generation with a more modern point of view. Their focus was on the plant and not so much on the community. Future plant superintendents were still powerful figures in this one-industry town, but others began to play more significant roles, such as the Snyder Brothers. In 1921, the Post and the Tribune were combined into one newspaper by J. Ralph and H.B. Snyder. They not only controlled the city's main source of news, but also played an active role in city affairs.
The city of Gary always loved a parade, and by the end of the 1930s, the 4th annual Christmas parade down Broadway was a big event. Over 100,000 people came downtown to see the parade, which marched from 5th Avenue to 18th on an overcast and cold December day, and what they got was quite a show. The high school bands were there, of course, from Lew Wallace High School, from Wirt High School, and the others. And there were a few dozen floats. The Post-Tribune said many of them were built by the schools.
Emerson's school presented Old King Cole and his Fiddlers Three, who went through a pantomime as the parade moved on. A showy entry was that of Horace Mann's school. 4 of the 24 blackbirds of the famed pie baked for a king were shown in a white-covered monstrous pie, while the king awaited on his throne for a feast.
In addition, there were 264 mummers in the parade. Keeping with the storybook character theme of the parade, there was Pinocchio, there was Paul Bunyan, and there were characters from The Wizard of Oz, along with many others. The parade in early December of 1939 came in the last days of a difficult decade in the history of Gary and of the country. Many of Gary were still feeling the impact of the Depression. But almost 2 years from the day that this parade marched down Broadway, Gary, America, and the world would be plunged into another crisis, one which was much more deadly.
It was a Sunday morning when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, a day that everyone who was old enough at that time can clearly remember, the beginning of America's involvement in World War II. Once again, the young men of Gary were sent off to the war, and the people of Gary tried to do their part, as their sons, husbands, and brothers were sent to fight in Europe or the Pacific. While the soldiers did their job, the people back home did what they could to help them win the fight. Just as in World War I, the steel mills of Gary were needed to produce many of the materials for war for the United States Armed Forces. And with 16,000 Gary men serving in those armed forces, there was a shortage of labor. Women filled that shortage. Life magazine sent one of its top photographers to Gary during the war to show what the women of Gary were doing. Margaret Burke White's photographs of the women working at U.S. Steel made the cover of Life magazine, and an 8-page photo spread inside. According to the article, over 4,800 women were working in the mill by the midpoint of the war, and some, like 32-year-old Legarish Larry, were raising 4 children while working as laborers. Others, like 22-year-old Victoria Bratko, were taking the jobs of their brothers who were in the war. There were other ways for the people back home to help. War bond drives raised money for the government to finance the war. In an effort to increase sales, actress Dorothy Lamour was brought to Gary for one drive. It worked. That drive brought in $4 million in new pledges. And the kids helped. 15,000 Gary school children called themselves all-out Americans. They reminded people not to waste food and collected scrap metal to aid the war effort.
The post office did a booming business as the boys overseas kept in touch with the people back home. The newspaper also carried reports of our men in uniform. But the war exploits of one Gary native made national news. Tom Harmon was a sports hero at Gary's Horseman High School in the 30s. He went on to national fame playing football at Michigan, where he won the Heisman Trophy as the best college football player in the nation in 1940. When the war broke out, Harmon got drafted. As a pilot, he twice escaped death. Once when his plane was crash-landed during a storm, and again when it was shot down by Japanese. He came home from the war a hero and went on to a successful career as a sportscaster.
Another Gary hero was photographer John Bushemy. Bushemy worked for the Post-Tribune and enlisted in the Army before the war. He was a combat photographer and recognized as one of the best. His photos of action in the South Pacific received international acclaim. In 1944, on a South Pacific island, he was killed by a Japanese mortar shell. Time magazine called him probably the best-known non-com in the Pacific area.
Gary had many heroes during the war. Most of the 16,000 who were sent to fight came home with the medals they earned, but the war also took its toll. Nearly 700 came home with serious injuries, and 460 Gary men died in the war.
It often happens during wartime. The economy was growing, the Depression days were gone, the steel industry was booming, and Gary appeared to be prosperous again. When the war ended, downtown Gary was again the center of Northwest Indiana. If you wanted to shop or see a show, this was the place to come.
But Gary, back in those days, was nice. They ran a streetcar right down Broadway, all the way to Glen Park, to Crown Point. You could walk downtown Gary, go to movies. We had about 6 movie houses in Gary.
The crowds on any day were shoulder to shoulder. You could stop at any one of numerous theaters. Just had a good time in Gary.
And downtown area was just beautiful. People would walk down there, and people come from all around and come into Gary.
It was also a prosperous time for Gary's black business community, which generally catered to the city's still growing black population.
I can remember very, very distinctly when African Americans in the city of Gary were manufacturers. They made things like brooms, the Douglas broom business, insecticide by Shelby Black. Alexander Williams Jr. was a sausage maker and a grocer. There were tailors. There were pharmacists. There were all kinds of business people in addition to the professionals, the MDs and the attorneys.
At the beginning of the war, 18% of Gary's population was African American. For the first time, African Americans outnumbered European American immigrants. By 1950, the gap had widened. 29% of Gary was African American, only 11% were born in Europe. Gary was changing. The children of the immigrants were more American than European. They looked and sounded like Americans, but many still lived in the old neighborhoods, neighbors to Gary's black people.
My friends in early life were the Turners, were the Lacefields, were the Rainies, were the Colemans, all African Americans. But also my friends at the time were the Caseys and the Rakoskis and Polish Americans. We lived in the same community and grew up as children together and played together. But every day we went to segregated schools, East Pulaski and West Pulaski.
As the war ended, Frable was still the only integrated school in Gary, but it was becoming more black. The city's black population had almost doubled during the 40s, and many of the new black children of Gary were being sent to Frable. The tension between the races was growing. In 1945, just weeks after the war ended, it was about to explode.
2 world wars, and a major economic depression. Gary came through these national crises in fairly good shape. As long as the steel industry remained strong, the economy was strong. But it was still a one-industry town. Gary was also rapidly becoming one of the most black cities in America, but was still a town with strong segregation. It was also a city having trouble controlling vice, crime, and political corruption. The future looked good to most as the war ended. Gary was still proudly feeling like the magic city of steel. But the problems of crime, political corruption, and race were growing rapidly. The problems had taken root and were about to quickly spread.